A sweeping new report in Vanity Fair looks at how toxic politics and hidden agendas in the U.S. government have blocked the examination of COVID-19's origin. Joining us now, the author of that report, contributor to Vanity Fair, Catherine Eban.
Catherine, I would like to build this up, but I'm one of these guys that say, why don't we just kill Hamlet in the first act? I see this part right here. And explain this to us.
Okay.
At a December 2020 State Department meeting, one official admonished his colleagues not to ask questions about the Wuhan Institute of Virology's controversial coronavirus research known as gain of function, something we've heard in the news a lot over the past week. Why, you ask? She tells us, as it would call attention to the U.S. government support for that research. Right. Tell us what that means.
So let me just first say this is one of the most complicated stories that I have ever reported. And I said it's like an Escher drawing where every time you think you've gotten to the top of the staircase, then you have to go and it takes another twist. You know, but the fact of the matter is that the U.S. was and is heavily invested in gain-of-function research, including grant money that went to the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Very quickly explain to our viewers gain of function.
Okay, so gain of function is basically the effort to sort of alter a pathogen in some manner to see if it can become more infectious to humans.
And you do that why?
And you do it, there's reasons to do it, which is it can help with vaccine development, it can help detect risks. But there are other people who describe it as looking for a gas leak with a lighted match. You know, that basically by trying to gauge the infectiousness of certain pathogens potentially, that you run the risk of unleashing them. And why do that when they don't exist in nature to begin with?
So let's back up.
Okay.
So what I said to you at the top was basically in 2020, after the election, there's a meeting in the State Department. An official tells everybody, back off. Don't ask too many questions about what China's doing, what they're doing in Wuhan, because that may come back to bite the United States government because they helped with funding of gain-of-function research.
So, you know, the article documents this very sharp divide between these two groups within the State Department. The people who were within the meeting were just shocked to hear a U.S. government official.
Can you tell us who that is, by the way?
Well, sure. I name him in the story, Christopher Park,
okay.
Who is a biological policy expert in the State Department, and they were shocked to hear somebody in the U.S. government arguing against transparency and. One of the people we quoted, Thomas DiNanno, who's a State Department official, said that it smelled like a cover-up and he didn't want to be a part of it. Now, the Christopher Park, when I interviewed him, said what he was arguing against is making a leap in logic to say that there is something untoward about gain-of-function research to begin with. It's not to say it's fishy. But, Thomas DiNanno documented in a memo that I obtained the idea that his team, he ran the Bureau of Arms Control Verification and Compliance, his team felt they were repeatedly being told not to dig in sensitive places, and in sensitive places where it would be linked to the U.S. government's involvement in gain-of-function research, whether that was its funding of it or that it performed it itself.
Walter.
Let me ask you, there's a character in your piece, Peter Daszak. Now, he's the one, an American zoologist, and he's funded by the National Institutes of Health, right? And he's funded to do gain-of-function research, right? And he's working for the working with the Wuhan Institute, and even some of the grant money gets transferred there. Is that sort of the issue at stake, that we were funding gain-of-function research and we knew that it was being done in Wuhan?
That is, EcoHealth Alliance's model, which some people raise questions about, is that there's sort of a scientific middleman, that they're divvying up these grants and they're parceling them out, partially to further their goal, which is go out into these super remote areas, find these bat samples and bring them back. Now, critics of Daszak say, you're going out into the remotest areas, finding these samples, bringing them back to these crowded metropolises like Wuhan, which has 11 million people in it, and then you have this fundamental problem. Why, in the dead of winter, when most bats are hibernating, in a city where there are no bats, in a market where they're not sold, would we have an outbreak with the Wuhan Institute of Virology 7 miles away, doing this risky, dangerous research in gain-of-function research to try to soup up these pathogens?
So public health experts and officials, publicly at least, we had Dr. Fauci on yesterday, won't commit to the zoonotic transfer or the lab leak. They say it's too early, we're doing research, there's not enough evidence to make a declarative statement about either. You talked to, I assume, hundreds of people for this incredible story. What is the leading theory when you talk to experts who've been studying this? Do they lean more toward a lab leak or toward the animal transfer?
At this point, I don't know if it's, every individual has a leading theory.
Right.
And for a long time, part of the issue was the sort of mantra that there is a scientific consensus. Now, Peter Daszak was involved in what it appears to be manufacturing a scientific consensus through an early article in The Lancet in which he sort of stage managed it with a lot of people who work for him and that he pays, who were co-signers on that statement. But in fact, at this point, I wouldn't say that there is scientific consensus, and I think the people who say they know where this came from probably don't know what they're talking about. When I investigated the lab leak question and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, there is smoke coming out of every single window. But what I set out to do as an investigative journalist is just track what happened to the legitimate questions that were being asked, not the conspiracy theories, and that was a lot of the reporting, is to strip those away. But what happened to the legitimate questions of credible doubters who looked at this fact pattern and said, wait a second, doesn't this deserve an equal investigation?
So what were the years, really quick, what were the years that you thought you're looking at where the government didn't want, was it from the beginning? I guess I should say the time frame. Was it from January of 2020 moving forward that they didn't want those questions asked?
Well, let's put it this way. As Richard Ebright, who's a scientist who I interviewed, said, it took him about a picosecond or a nanosecond to think about the Wuhan Institute of Virology as soon as he heard about, a mysterious potential novel coronavirus in Wuhan.
Right.
So it started right away, the questions, January, February 2020.
Let's take one more big step back and talk about why this story is important. We've gone so far down the road, on television and in the media, about what it would mean if there were a lab leak that China covered up, that perhaps some United States scientists were interested in keeping quiet. What would be the implications of lying about something that escaped and killed 3.5 million people in the world?
The implications are almost mind-boggling. It's like a Chernobyl for the field of virology and science in general, I think. This idea that because of this research that you had unleashed this pathogen on the world, that's staggering. And so I think in many ways, mentally, it's a lot easier and more relaxing to sit around and think about a zoonotic origin.
This has become obviously such a toxic political issue with
Yes.
the right slamming on it. We've already been previewed. We were talking earlier how the former President Trump is going to be back holding a rally this weekend. His aides have said that he's going to be talking about this and blaming China for it. So walk us through what happens next. The Biden administration just in the last few days said that they found new intelligence that has caused them to sort of reopen the investigation. He's pressing agencies over the next 90 days or so to figure out, to learn as much as they can. What is your sense of what they're looking at and what they could find?
A couple of interesting points on that. One of the big sort of leads or pieces of information, which was about sick researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology that sort of predated the pandemic. And these were, by the way, researchers who were working on gain-of-function issues. Part of that came apparently from a foreign source indicating to U.S. investigators, look in your own files. You've got information there. So I think the idea with the Biden intelligence analysis is, you know, even if the Chinese are not willing to give access to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, there is a lot to be gleaned from our own intelligence files.
Which is so interesting because in the early part of this, and when people started writing stories even in June of 2020, we heard about the mad dash in late fall, early winter of 2019, and into early 2020, U.S. officials in the Trump administration urgently trying to get the Chinese to cooperate with us. And you're saying that some of the members of the Trump administration could have looked in their own files and found some clues?
Well, that's right. I mean, so basically at this point, you know, China has said, I mean, it said at the World Health Assembly meeting a week and a half ago, the investigation inside China is over. We are not cooperating anymore. We're not opening up lab notebooks. We're not giving you access to our raw data. So then the question becomes, how do we ever answer this question? And I think the idea is that there is information that we have in our own possession, that allies, foreign allies, may have in their own possession, you know, as well as sort of the statistical capabilities of the U.S. government.
And we should